All right, everyone. I suppose now we'll go ahead and start our tribal allyship training session. My name is Roland. I'm the tribal engagement coordinator here at Tree People, and we are happy to have you all join us this afternoon. And we will let our friends at Sacred Places Institute, walk us through a lot of these topics today. So I just wanted to take the moment and say welcome and yeah, thank you. If anyone wants to step in and take it away, thanks.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriella. I'm going to be working with Jessa today to do the grounding and land acknowledgement. So I'll be starting with the land acknowledgement, and then I will be passing it off to Jessa for the grounding. So, mi hawen nehinkin, netwani ne Gabriella Lassos, tongvet neha. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriella Lassos, and I'm Gabrielino Tongva. To begin this land acknowledgement, I would like to share with you the significance of acknowledging those who are the traditional stewards of the land that we live on. Land acknowledgement is practiced to formally recognize and respect Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the territory that we inhabit. Land acknowledgement is also the first step in educating ourselves on building deeper and more meaningful decolonized relationships with Native peoples and the land itself. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and a connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. Indigenous people across the US still live in relative invisibility. This invisibility is due to a multitude of factors, including cultural and historical erasure. Across the country, Natives are fighting for reparations, land return, recognition, and their sovereignty, but the American public continues to hear very little about these battles. The land that we live on was not willingly given up by those who tended to it centuries ago. And because of this, we must consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. I would like to share this website with you. It's the Native American Heritage Commission website. It's going to be dropping in the chat. And this takes you to a map where you can see throughout the state of California whose lands that you are currently residing on. So as you open this website, you'll see a little disclaimer pop up, and I ask that you read this and consider this as you continue to learn about whose homelands you're residing on. This website allows you to see whose native lands you're residing on wherever you are in this remote environment. And utilizing this resource allows you to begin understanding the scope of colonization and the groups that were directly affected by it. If you're comfortable doing so in the chat, feel free to add whose ancestral lands you reside on today. Thank you so much for allowing me to take this time. And then I will be passing it on to Jessa.
Aweshkoneha, Gabriella. Mi'iha, everybody. Natwanya ne, Jessa Calderon. Tongvet neha, koi mixkanakin. Koi yueme. Hello, relatives. My name is Jessa Calderon. I am Chumash, Tongva, as well as Yoeme, and I am currently calling in from Tongva territories today in the San Fernando Valley, which is the outskirts of Los Angeles County. I'm honored to be here with you all, and today we're going to, or at this moment, we're going to do a grounding exercise. So if you wish to participate, feel free to turn your cameras off if they're not already. And if you don't want to participate, that's okay too. So I'm going to ask that you close your eyes and take a deep breath in through your nose, pulling in that oxygen down into the lungs and filling the lungs filling up with that unconditional loving healing energy. And go ahead and exhale out of the mouth, releasing any stagnant energy that the body no longer needs. Breathing in through the nose and allowing that loving healing energy from the oxygen that surrounds us to fill the body and hug every cell in the body, re-energizing the body fully, and exhale out through the mouth. Again, breathing in that positive, loving, healing energy into the body and allowing it to be felt all over the body, but focusing our attention on the neck and shoulders and allowing the neck and shoulders to be calm and completely relaxed. And as you exhale out through the mouth, any tension that was stuck in the neck and shoulders is now released out through that breath. As you hear me speak, continue to breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth. Deep breaths, reminding ourselves that every breath in is positive, loving, and healing energy, and every breath out is positive, loving, healing energy. And in this way, we are reciprocal with the universe around us, with the oxygen around us. Place your attention now at the base of your spine, and in the front of the body at the base of the spine, visualize a beautiful red light moving in from the front of the body and out through the back. And this beautiful red light moves in a clockwise direction, as if there was a clock on the front of the body facing the wall in front of us. And this beautiful red light is moving from the 1 to the 3 to the 6 to the 9 to the 12, continuously moving in this direction from the front of the body and out through the back. As this beautiful light channels through, it removes any and all blockages, removing stagnancy, removing anger, removing fear, removing anxiety, and bringing forth unconditional love, the ability to be stable and grounded, and the feeling of feeling safe and content. Taking a deep breath in through the nose and recognizing I am safe, I am protected, I am here in this very moment, here and now. I am focused. I release the memories of the past, and I focus on this moment with an open heart, with an open mind, and visualizing from the base of the spine, roots like that from the tree, coming down from the base of the spine and into the earth. As these roots grow deeper, stronger, and wider, they allow us to feel completely stable and completely grounded. And as they find their way into the earth, they remind us of our connection to the earth, knowing that just like the earth, we are made of water and minerals. Begin to feel unconditional, loving, healing energy from the earth pulsating up these roots, up our feet, up the legs and the knees, up the hips, up the abdomen and low back, all the way up through the throat and out through the top of the head, where this energy finds its way back into the earth. And we understand that this energy is constantly flowing through the earth and through us and back to the earth. She is constantly blessing us with her unconditional, loving, healing energy. It is up to us to open up, to feel and respond to that energy, to accept that energy, and understanding that through this connection to the earth continues to provide for us for food, water, and shelter. The earth has never charged us for any of these things. The earth continues to provide these things for free. And as we recognize these gifts from the earth, we give our gratitude, and we choose now to give back to the earth in a good way, to understand what reciprocity means, and to be very grateful for all of the blessings that have been bestowed upon us through this Mother Earth, who cares greatly and deeply for her children. Thank you, Mother Earth, for loving us. Thank you, Mother Earth, for loving us. Thank you, Mother Earth, for loving us. And in return, we choose to love you back, to treat you with love and kindness, and to tread lightly on your grounds. Taking a deep breath in through the nose and absorbing all of that loving, healing energy and oxygen, allowing every cell to be filled with love and oxygen. Exhaling out through the mouth, opening the heart, opening the mind, and allowing ourselves to be fully present in this moment. Go ahead and wiggle your fingers and wiggle your toes, open your eyes, and be here with us, fully involved. Awash Ganeha, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it over to Maritza when Maritza is ready.
Thank you so much, Jessa. That's incredibly helpful. I almost forgot that I went next. So I really do appreciate every time that you help all of us to ground ourselves and remind ourselves of where we are and why we're here. And so with that, I'd like to transition into just quickly going over community agreements. You all, most of you already know this, but just as a formal reminder, keep an open mind and heart, open one mic, I was going to say open mic, be respectful and allow others to finish their thoughts. Be mindful of the space that you're taking. Raise your hand, use the raise hand button and remember to turn it off. Be conscious of intent versus impact. And we all know that, or should know that dismantling systems of oppression benefits absolutely everyone. And liberation is possible, always. And as well, really important here, give credit where it's due. As well, be your own boo, lick your own wounds, just be careful with that. And I forgot to mention, my name is Maritza Alvarez, Piali Nochime. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And then we're going to move on now that we went over community agreements to the agenda. I'll be swift introductions as we started with. You'll see SPI and Tree People bios there for you to look through. In the first section, we'll cover water, culture, and origin, and providing an Indigenous context for everyone. Then we're going to go on to the 4 C's: capitalism, settler colonialism, commodification, and contamination. And then we're going to move on to working with Native nations and Indigenous peoples today. And most important, it's allyship. How to, well, everything is important, but very important is allyship. And then we'll close off. So thank you, everyone, and welcome again.
Thank you, Maritza and Jessa and Gabriela, for opening this up in a good way and getting us grounded. Miriam, Nosun Angela Muni DRC, Nosun Ahashamam. I'm Angela Muni DRC. I'm Ahashamam. Our ancestral homelands are in what's now known as Orange County, California, and I too am a guest on unceded Tonga homelands. Sacred Places Institute's mission is to build the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. And we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. So just much gratitude to Tree People for engaging in this now several year-long collaboration with us, and to all of you for showing up today. I've been doing this work for over 20 years in Southern California, and it really does warm my heart to see the way the level of interest is raising and the way that folks are really committed to showing up and doing their part to learn how to be better allies. You can scroll through the bios for everyone from Tree People and SPI. I'm not going to go through them all now because we really want to get to the training. But I'll let Roland say a couple of words about Tree People, and then we will turn it back over to Gabriela and Jessa to get us started with part 1.
Thank you. My name is Roland Pacheco. I'm the Tribal Engagement Coordinator at Tree People. I am also a Hashiman. So this work that Tree People is doing with Sacred Places Institute is an incredibly fulfilling opportunity, and, to my background and my upbringing. So I'm just really happy to be involved. So thank you.
And I'll be kicking us off. We'll be starting off talking about water, culture, and origin. So I'll provide some Indigenous context to these. And I want to start with locating ourselves. We're located currently in what is now known as Los Angeles County. And so the biggest river that we all are aware of is what is now called the Los Angeles River, the Baime Pachai. And it stems from the waters of the Simi Hills, Santa Ana Mountains, with tributaries streaming from the San Gabriel Mountains. And this river was an important means to travel. It was a rich food source, a gathering place for ceremonial purpose, as well as a place to gather basket materials and much more. This is a place where Tongva families understood the fresh water was a necessity, therefore they contributed to a healthy ecosystem to sustain all life in and around the water. We identify water as a living entity. We understand that water is an energy source. And that means so much more to us as Indigenous people. Indigenous people understand that the lands, waters have always had its natural cleansing and healing system. From the rocks, the pebbles, the sand, the plant roots, which all contain energy within themselves. They give the water healing qualities from that energy. But also the rocks, the pebbles, the sand, the dirt, the plant roots are a natural cleansing system. They all are a place for many species to live and thrive as well. When the damming occurs, it creates stagnancy in the water. The water's natural cleansing system is now removed, causing the water to become easily infected with disease, such as deadly algae. And it causes natural life, such as our salmon and other fish, to die off, which then happens to make contaminants that are, and also it's the contaminants that are poured into the water that cause the disease and the death of our loved ones, our relatives in the water. And so I don't know how many of you knew that we had salmon and trout in the Los Angeles River, because when we think of it today, we don't think of it the same way as the Indigenous did. And so I do want to ask for any of you who would like to think about this, sit with it and answer in the chat. Can you describe to us what water as a living entity means to you? Also, what are some of the ways that you practice respecting water? And can you describe what water as an energy source means to you? I want to discuss also relationships and reciprocity. Our people knew that vibration was an important part of life. Every form of life is vibrating and tuning into vibrations, causing different reactions. When one has a good and loving intention, they release good and loving vibrations outside of themselves. The intention or prayers going into paddling the riverways, bathing and drinking the energetically charged and natural systemically cleansed water, the intention in collecting food in or near the water, collecting materials for common uses, was all a contributing factor to maintaining a healthy, vibrating ecosystem. We all sang to each other and kept the loving vibrations high and pure. We all had good intention behind our actions and made sure to do our part in keeping one another healthy. So that's us with the water with us with the plants with us with the animals with us, and all of us together. We all sang to each other. We all took care of each other, and we understood, take only what you need. That has been a teaching that we as Indigenous people still live by today. So when people came here with the intention to steal, to kill, and to take with malintent and bad vibrations, the healthy ecosystem as we knew it began to shift into the ecosystem, the sick ecosystem that we are surrounded with today. And it's not enough to talk about it like the partner who's sorry with promises that they'll change tomorrow. It's beyond time to get back to the practices. Although we are far behind to revitalizing the practice of healthy relationship and reciprocity, if we continue to make excuses as if we could never get back there, meanwhile continuing to overindulge and overdevelop, we will surely completely devastate our homelands, and that's what is left of it. So I urge you all to think about what I'm saying today, to think about the Indigenous ways of being, and encourage you all to participate in understanding relationships and reciprocity and how you can move forward with those practices. Awesh Koneha for sitting and listening, and I will turn it over to any questions. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the box, or you can raise your hand.
Thank you, Jessa. While we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I'm just going to read some of the comments in the chat here. Thank the water every morning before taking a drink. Water is life. Without water, there is no life. Feeling water's pain. Taught that water is an extension of us, and in turn, we are of it. It's our job to keep it clean. And it looks like there aren't any more questions at this point. So I will ask you a question, Jessica, since we have a couple of minutes. Why do you think it's important for us to begin these trainings on how to be a better ally with this grounding on more local Indigenous perspectives on water?
Unfortunately, in our public systems and schools, we are conditioned to see things in a different way than the Indigenous people, and that is to take and take and take, and not question, where things are coming from or how to respect things. We have been conditioned not even to respect ourselves. And so in joining conversations like this, we are helping each other to understand the meaning behind Indigenous thought, what intention is, what reciprocity is, what relationship is, how to be respectful and mindful of these things. And unfortunately, in the Western way of conditioning, those are not things that are held in high regard as they are traditionally in the Indigenous community. And so by having these conversations, folks will see that we have always held these relatives sacred. And when I say relatives, I mean the water, I mean the animals that, coincide with us, I mean the plant life. We have always seen these as relatives. In fact, when we share our stories about these relatives, we call them people, we call them humans. So we talk about the plant people, we talk about the animal people, the insect people. When they're in our stories, we don't see them, we don't objectify them. They're not things, they're people, they are our relatives. And we know that all of them, the insects, those that you can't even see but you can feel, that they all relate to us, and that everything has energy within it. And so in that understanding, we also have a saying, we are all related, or all my relations. And one way to look at that is that every single thing has energy. And so, for instance, when my body goes to rest, my energy, it dissipates from my body, but it lives forever. And that energy is how we are all related. And so we need to identify that energy as being in the water traditionally, being in the plants traditionally, and being in, being in the animals. And unfortunately, when you think about how water is now being capped off, we're killing the water. We're destroying it. We're suffocating it with all the poisons that are being poured into it, the concrete that's being poured into it. So having these discussions help people to understand outside of the Western mindset and why we are in this crisis that we're in now.
Thank you so much. You always have such amazing brilliance to share. I always learn from you. There's a great question in the chat that actually, as long as I've been doing these kinds of trainings, I've never heard, and I think it's a wonderful question. So thank you, Lauren, for asking it. I'll read it right now and turn it over to Justin and then anyone else who has any reflections. But the question is, I'm wondering about Indigenous practices around forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiving ourselves who have overindulged, misused, exploited, did not protect water, and with sincerity promised to do better. So what are Indigenous perspectives on forgiveness as it relates to the environmental situation we're in now?
At this moment in time, I'm going to have to answer this question from my perspective and not all Indigenous people, because the fact of the matter is that we all have our own mindsets, and we're all raised differently with different practices. But I will say it's important to forgive, because unfortunately, as Indigenous people, we don't have the power to shut down corporate America. We don't have the power to have people not pour concrete into our rivers and take everything over. We've lost everything, and that included our human rights, and that included the ability to protect our loved ones, our relatives around us. And so I know myself personally, when I drive into Los Angeles, when I walk through Los Angeles, when I ride my bike through Los Angeles, my heart aches. When I see the Los Angeles River and I put my prayers down into the river, I want to cry, because I know that this is not natural. I know that this is not normal. And I know that my ancestors had told the first invaders, you cannot live that close to the river. It's dangerous. And so every time the indigenous people did try to speak up, they were shunned, they were arrested, they were killed. And so I have to understand personally, that's not my fault. And that's not my relatives' fault. They did the best that they could with what they could. And so for that reason, forgiveness has to be held, because if we're holding guilt, that's not our guilt to hold. We're only going to have ourselves be sick. And there's no point to that. I can't continue to raise my voice and try to protect what I possibly can if I'm ill and lying in bed. So yeah, that's what I'll say with that for now. I can, go on forever, but thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say one final thing and then turn it over to Gabriela to take us into the next section. But first, really appreciate you naming that none of us can speak for all Indigenous people. Even though a lot of times, that's what folks want or think that's how it is. So likewise, I also do not speak for all Indigenous people. But thinking about that question around forgiveness, it actually made me think of Gabriela's aunt, Barbara Drake, who hopefully some of you were fortunate enough to meet in life. She was a phenomenal woman and just embodied kindness and the spirit of being a gracious host more than almost anyone I've met in my life, native or not native. And one moment that I was fortunate enough to have with her that was so powerful for me was at a learning garden that she'd established. And myself included, and a lot of Native folks I know, get really angry about the non-native invasive plant species, because those non-native species have literally, strangled out and destroyed our native plant relatives in much the same way that settler colonists attempted to do with us. But in this learning garden, Barbara had, plants, even from some of the original trees in the orchards in the mission. And when she talked about that, she talked about what it must have meant, in trying to be from the perspective of these travelers who came from so far, and what it must have meant for them to be able to bring a piece of home with them. And it was just such a beautiful way. I'd never thought, I'm ashamed to admit, I'd never thought about non-native plant species in that way before. But in that moment, what really the lesson I took from what she said was that lesson of forgiveness, right? And that was about her seeing the life's essence or the humanity in other people. And so I think that's really the key to it. Like, we are in this situation, and as Jessa said, it's dire, and we need each other to move forward. And forgiveness is really about recognizing the life in others and being committed to moving forward in good ways. So with that, I will turn it over to Gabriela.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be going over the capitalism, settler colonialism, commodification, and contamination stuff. A lot of heavy things, but we're going to be watching videos throughout to sort of like hone in on certain parts of these 4 C's. And I'll just go ahead and get started. So the first video that some of you might have seen, but it wasn't the video that we sent out for this training, is the aqueduct between us. It was filmed by one of, or it was produced by one of the people who work on the media team here at SPI. His name is Isaiah Mendoza, and the film was directed by his older sister, Anne Marie. So he wrote this little blurb here. I'm going to read it off, and then we will go ahead and watch the video, and then I'll keep talking. So the aqueduct between us first began life as a panel discussion centering on the LADWP's long and documented history of extractive water practices in the Owens Valley. The film was produced over the course of 2 years, assembled from over 15+ hours of footage to serve as an oral history detailing the shared experience of both Tongva and Paiute alike. An incredible amount of love was put into the piece as we saw this as the opportunity to tell our story. It was our intention with the film to record as many authentic accounts, perspectives, and settings in our effort to bring a much needed Indigenous perspective to the conservation of water in California. And then we'll go ahead and play the video.
what we call our homeland is Paya de Nadu.
It's the place of flowing water. I would venture to say that most people coming up into the Owens Valley from Los Angeles would not really have that same descriptor to call this place. But it is what our people called it because it was a place of flowing water.
Our word for water is Paya. Paya is culturally significant to us because it's life. We believe it's a life force. We believe it is life in itself.
To us, water's sacred. We've always known that because when we spread our water, we created life.
We had the river running down at a huge lake at the bottom that they now call Owens Lake. We called it Patsiata. There was just this abundance of resources. It's not only food, it's your clothing, it's your house, it's your medicine, it's your basket material, everything, and it all depends on that water.
So I chose this clip in particular because it basically showcases how colonialism, capitalism, commodification, and contamination have affected the Paiute people in regards to their even ability to access their water. The movement of the water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles has definitely impacted the Paiute community as well as the Tongva community, as well as communities in between who aren't the First Peoples. The just forced extraction and movement of water against its will has definitely had detrimental effects. The next short film that we shared is the Indigenous Voices on Sacred Waters. This one was produced in particular for this training, and it focuses on Indigenous perspectives on the ways that water is treated in current day. And I will go ahead and let the video play.
When these organizations and state agencies recognize that we are part of the conversation and not just a number in the back, it makes it really meaningful because it gets rid of that erasure factor. It's like saying, yes, you're here, you exist, and we want to hear what you have to say. But it also allows for Indigenous people to start to feel more comfortable talking to these agencies who have alienated them for so long, who have taken their land, who have done all of these things that have negatively impacted Indigenous people. It makes it hard because there's a lot of negative feelings towards these agencies because of all of that happened in the past. But that shouldn't stop these agencies from still trying to reach out and include us in the conversation.
But as we've been experiencing in reality, what this means for some state agencies is invite us to a tribal consultation meeting or roundtable and then check the box and call it a day.
We should be beyond the point where agencies think that all they have to do is sit in a room and let us tell them what we want to say, and then they can go off and do what they plan to do in the first place.
So to finish what Tony Cordero was saying, letting agencies go on and do what they plan to do in the first place. This clip in particular, I felt was important to share with all of you because of the agency background that you might be coming from. State agencies play an important role in the connection between water and people. State agencies have that power to sort of educate the community on where the water is coming from and who is impacted by the way that water is moving. Allowing Indigenous people, especially those from local tribes, to have co-management opportunities allows the public to see that Indigenous people are still here and not a thing of the past, which is really hard, especially in the sense of unfederally recognized tribes like the Tongva and the Ahashiman, because we don't have that plot of land, we don't have that reservation that says, yeah, those people are still here. They have a reservation and they have a casino and all of that stuff, because that's kind of what California indigeneity is seen as by non-Indigenous people. Like, oh, they have their casinos and they have their land. Why do they need anything more? And it's kind of putting that in a perspective, like a lot of tribes still don't have that land, still don't have any power or voice, even though they do have their tribal councils, which have sovereignty. It's still very difficult to be taken seriously when you don't have physical or things that other people can see that are like claimed, if that makes sense. Meaningful consultation and co-management is so much more important than the performative kind that a lot of agencies currently engage in. Tony Cordero said that in a much better way than I did. But it's really important that agencies step up to the table and take Indigenous voices seriously and don't just say, yeah, we checked off the box, the Indigenous people, we talked to them, and have a meeting with them and only have, and like, be supposed to be taking notes at a meeting, and then the notes only have like 3 bullet points when it's a tribal engagement meeting. So that's just really important. And then these meaningful consultations allow for trust between tribes and agencies to be built, which is something that's really hard to do because tribes do have this distrust of state agencies and people coming in and taking tribal lands and all of that. It's a long, convoluted like trauma history that all ties into like how Indigenous people are going to interact with the state. So I'll focus on the concretization of the river. And so the river has been denaturalized for the benefit of settlers. Like Jessa said earlier, we weren't meant to be living so close to the water. But because of that water, because we didn't want it to flood, because we didn't want certain things for the water to do, but we still wanted the water, we went and built everything right next to it. And then we decided we're going to build dams, or we're going to put it in basically an aqueduct and still call it a river. The effort to stop yearly flooding has disrupted nature and has led to many native plants and animals disappearing from the LA River, as Jessa shared before. And the concrete also creates a disconnect between the people of LA and the river because they no longer see it as a body of water, a living body of water, but as infrastructure, as something that gets water from point A to point B, rather than a living entity that the water moves on its own, if that makes sense. I will let the video play.
And the channelization that they have contributed to is part of why we don't have our salmon and our freshwater relatives.
I mean, I would like to be more connected with my homelands, but with all the concrete and everything, it just doesn't feel right at all.
And that just sort of emphasized the point that I just shared, that there's a disconnect. It's hard for people to feel connected with the water when it's seen in a non-natural way, if that makes sense. But it needs to be seen as water for water, as the living entity itself, and something that is being controlled against its will. And we will go on to the outsourcing of water. So I'm going to go ahead and let this video play first, and then I'll talk a little bit more.
Representatives of the city of Los Angeles entered the city in arguably very shiesty ways. They very much came in hidden, disguised as local new families that were moving, and buying up land as though they were going to come and live here. Only later on did the local people find out that they were under the guise of a much bigger plan and agenda.
By 1895, Mulholland, Eaton, and Lippincott come here, but they wanted water for LA because LA outgrew the LA River. Once they hit the population of 250,000 people, they knew that they needed more water for LA to get bigger. And that's where they got the idea of building LA Aqueduct.
In 1904, William Mulholland and Fred Eaton began purchasing land in the Owens Valley. In 1905, there was a bond that the city of Los Angeles approved to construct the aqueduct. So it all happened rather quickly. The construction began in 1908 and it was completed in 1913, I believe. And then during that same time period in 1912, President Taft set aside over 67,000 acres for possible reservation for the Indians.
Lands that were set aside for us were higher up on the fan and really were key places for moving water, which is why they really wanted those lands for Los Angeles to be able to control. And LA in the 30s did a series of reports to document the conditions of the people that were living here. The title of it says it all. We were the Indian problem.
That clip in particular is just really important in regards to the 4Cs because it shows how capitalism and colonialism led to a lot of contamination and led to a lot of the movement of the water for the benefit of the people. But in reality, it was also hurting the indigenous people that were living in that area. Water, it's important to know, like, outsourcing water is water coming from places different than other than its original source. The forced movement of water for the benefit of settlers, and to allow more people. So basically the water was moved from the Owens Valley to LA, to allow more people to settle in LA and for the people of LA to live comfortably and have that water without realizing that water was being taken from different parts of California. And this has been a huge part of California history. Water has always been something that we struggle with, in terms of, one, respecting it, two, realizing it's something not to be wasted and not like messed with, if that makes sense. Yeah, and outsourcing of water is important to keep in mind today as reservoirs are drying up. So same with the issue that we're facing right now, we're in a drought, but interestingly enough, we've been in a drought, but once again, the signs went away, but now the signs are coming back, like save water, when the sign should have been there the whole time. Like, we shouldn't have gone from like, oh, we're out of the drought because it rained for 1 year, because that was the mentality a lot of us had. And now that we're in this place where we are now, we're kind of realizing like, oh, wait, we should have been saving water the whole time because we still need water. And right now we seriously don't have it. Even like reservoirs that are out of state, like Lake Mead and the Colorado River, we take a lot of water from that. So now people are fighting over the water that's in Lake Mead, and the water that's in the Colorado River isn't even moving all the way down to Mexico anymore. So the indigenous people who live on the river in Mexico don't have access to the water. They literally only have sand left. So it's really hard. It's really important to put into perspective like who's being impacted by us moving water and taking water. Because more often than not, we are taking it from someone else who needs it, whether that be from another state, another country within the state. Water is where it is for a reason, so we shouldn't necessarily be moving it around.
Representative.
So where does your water come from? It's important to know where your water comes from so that you can properly show respect to the water itself. We need to keep in mind that the water is not willingly flowing into our homes. It is being forced to do so because of the infrastructure that has been put in place. And reconnection with water will help you understand why it's sacred and not something that we should be wasting. And I'm going to share this video, and it's going to be, I'm just gonna,
If you go into somebody else's home, you're a guest, and you treat their home in a manner that's respectful. Instead of saying, well, no, I don't agree with the way that this is set up. I want to transform your house because it's not beneficial to me. That's exactly what the colonizers have done in California. They've looked at our home and said, this is not beneficial, the way things are set up, the way that the river floods yearly. So we need to transform it. We need to change it in order for it to be beneficial for us. So the answer is to change our entire perspective of the environment, to view ourselves as guests to the land. That we're only here for a small, incredibly small time on this planet. Even as the race of human beings, we're only here for a small time on this planet. And the world will transform. And it's always been in transformation. And the solution is that we can be guests of the land, that we can be guests of the tribal nations, that we don't have to force either into submission, that they can exist on their own. That the land has power, the land has spirit, and that we should take that into consideration with what we do, the way we live.
So that one was just really important because it's kind of keeping in mind that we are guests. Our time here is finite, but the world will keep moving without us, with or without us. So it's just reemphasizing the reconnection of you with the land around you, you with the water around you, and why it's important not to like force changes on that land, if that made sense. I will go ahead and yeah, I didn't realize I was already done. So it's just really important that we keep in mind like these aspects of how capitalism, settler colonialism, commodification, and contamination have impacted our ability to interact with the water and have impacted the way that we as individuals see water, as whether we see it as a living entity or something that just flows into our homes when we need to take a shower, or when we need to wash our hands or do the dishes. And just keeping in mind that we need to have respect for that water that's coming to us against its will. So I will open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Gabriella, for sharing. Let's see, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. Don't see any raised hands. I think if folks would like to, or if you're shy to ask questions, maybe folks can just pop in the chat one thing that you've learned or that's been interesting to you so far from this training. Thoughts on how to work with ecological grief and loss and turn it into a healing action and to heal. We're getting deep today. It must be something in the stars. So anyone on SPI's team, including Gabriella, want to reflect on this? Thoughts on how to work with ecological grief and loss and turn it into a healing action and a healthy relationship.
I can go first. I think, I know personally, working with ecological grief and loss needs to begin with realizing that these things have been lost. A lot of the times we don't realize how the world around us has been impacted by our actions, whether it be the natural world or the other people around us. So once we sort of put that into perspective and realize that we can take that grief and turn it into something that's more healing, we can say like, hey, this whole area is taken over by non-native plants. How do we take out these non-native plants without killing them and taking them and putting them somewhere where they will thrive, but also reintroducing the native plants into the area? So it's kind of just not forcing, but creating relationships with the animals and plants that were brought here versus animals and plants that existed here prior to us even being here. And I will let someone else take it away.
I think that's an excellent response, Gabriella, and it just makes me think of the word that came to mind as you were talking was intentionality. I think, you hit it spot on. We can't grieve until we're intentional about that there's something to grieve for, right? And then once we're there, we can think about what our next steps are. And I feel like, honestly, everybody, we have almost 50 people here today, and we've had similar numbers for the other trainings. And as I said earlier today, that just really warms my heart. And I think that you all are taking a step in the right direction towards healing just by being here and seeing what we can do next. So there are a couple more questions in here. One question, what are some ways we can show reverence for the water flowing into our homes? And I'll let you all answer that while I'm looking over the next question.
I can go again. One thing that really stuck with me in terms of showing reverence for the water in our homes is just saying thank you to the water. Lori Sisquak, she is a elder. She teaches at Sherman Indian High School in Riverside. She taught me that, and I honestly do it every day. I will wash my hands and just, I know you might look like you're crazy talking to the water or talking to a plant. But just like saying, like apologizing to the water or saying thank you to the water for being there, for always being there for you, whether it has a choice or not, I feel is really important in showing reverence to that.
Really quickly is for me identifying that this water had a journey to get here. You know, when I could understand that this water went through a long journey to get to my sink, I'm going to honor it a lot, you know, with deeper respect and not be wasteful. And so I think when you understand that this water actually comes from somewhere, it doesn't just magically appear when I turn the knob, helps, you know, to create that relationship and understanding. And I think it's really important for us to educate ourselves once again of where this water comes from, because once we can see in our mind's eye and you know, our ideas, our thoughts of how this water travels from point A to point B, you know, we recognize the importance.
If I can also kind of just quickly chime in here, I think it's also, along with what Gabriella and Jessa have shared, so critical. Along with that is remembering that we're privileged in so many ways, and there's definitely class differences of people who have access to water. That should have never been the case, but it is, especially in the city, our access to clean water. And so those who have the monetary luxury to, for example, have a pool or a golf yard, a golf course in their community, or, you know, just these type of recreational things that require a lot of use of water compared to those who don't and struggle to, for example, pay a water bill. It's really important just to note that there's a class issue as well going on. And I think it makes us more grateful for the little water that we do have.
Thank you for sharing, everybody, and yeah, especially Marisa for highlighting the relationship between class and wealth and access to water, which is a global issue as well, right? Like in the U.S. As a whole, we're privileged as compared to other parts of the world, and then you peel that apart and you see who, you know, does and does not have access within any one system. So there are a couple of questions that are related here. One is about co-management. Are there examples of co-management in California that can be modeled for other agencies? And then the question right above it is related steps that we would recommend where we can move in alliance with tribes to help move water agencies towards reparations, reconciliation, or at least facilitating more ecological and regenerative approaches. Yeah, all of that. It's huge. I think, you know, one of the things that Sacred Places Institute and Tree People are doing that I'm super excited about is developing these sketches, right? So we held tribal listening sessions on what kinds of projects people would like to see for water. And then out of those listening sessions, Tree People has put together sketches of what that could look like. And I'm super excited to kind of share that with the world, at least throughout Southern California. Because I've talked at length with folks at the state level and just, and you know, more locally, that it can be challenging sometimes because you have folks who are scientists or engineers who think in a really specific way about watershed planning. And that specific way tends not to involve any of the things that you know, have been shared today. And so it's not a malintent, it's just a disconnect. But what I'm so excited about that we put together with Tree People and that Tree People has really helped build out is that it's kind of translated what some of these Indigenous priorities are into what could actually be a tangible project. So I would say stay tuned, look out for that, and then expand your mind to think about those kinds of possibilities. In terms of co-management, a couple of things I wanted to name quickly are in the Bay Area, the watershed, the IRWIM planning bodies that are decision-making bodies. Now there are representatives from the local Ohlone tribe on those decision-making bodies. That's something that we pushed really hard for in Orange County and have thus far not been successful. But for me personally, I think that that's one of the most powerful ways that allies can show up, is really push these decision-making bodies to demand that there be representation from the local tribes in these decision-making spaces. And relatedly, if you get tapped to be one of those decision makers, look around the room and see, are there Tongva people? Are there Tataviam, if it's in Tataviam territory, Chumash? And if not, be willing to step up and step back if need be. We'll talk more about it in allyship, but one of our greatest allies, one of the reasons that they've been such a powerful ally is because they've absolutely been willing to use the power and pull that they have as leverage and have said, we will step out if local tribal people aren't here. And so I'm gonna, let's see, there was one more. Actually, we are running over our break time. So it's 12:58. I asked that you come back at, or it's 12:59 now. So we'll just say come back at 1:04 and we'll go over these last couple of questions and then I will start into the working with Native nations and then turn it over to Marisa. So come back at 1:04. Thank you. Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. If I can get folks to give me some thumbs up or smiley face emojis, just something so that I know people are back in the room, that would be fabulous. Okay, I see one thumbs up so far. Hoping for a few more. Okay. All right, there we go. There we go. Wonderful. Well, welcome back. As I said, I'm Angela Mooney, DRC, and I'll be talking about kind of the law and policy piece today, and then I'll be turning it over to Marisa to talk about some of the more exciting and innovative stuff happening in the legal realm. Next slide, please. So I want to start by honoring my ancestors and really talking about the ways in which this relates to the intergenerational nature of water work from an Indigenous perspective. Many of the people in these photos are no longer alive today, and many of them are elders that I learned a tremendous amount about water from and about Indigenous struggles to protect water. And, you know, it's always appropriate to name our elders and ancestors as a sign of respect. But additionally, I think it's important to do in the context of these types of trainings because often people who, you know, like yourselves who show up to these meetings are, you know, really invested in work around water and may have spent your entire lifetimes or careers on these subjects. And that's wonderful. But the reality is, and I think it's a critical point for folks to understand in terms of exploring how to be better allies to Indigenous peoples, is that for us, this work is lifelong and intergenerational, meaning that, you know, we learned it from our relatives and they learned it from theirs before them. So since the point of colonization, we've been fighting to protect our waters. And there's a lot of expertise that's embedded in that kind of, you know, long time, more than a single lifetime struggle. Next slide, please. I always like to name or not name because there's 180, but at least visually show all of how many Native nations there are in what's now known as California. And just as a reminder to folks that wherever you go, you are on Indigenous land. So there should really be no water decisions being made in California absent tribal involvement anywhere in the state. Next slide, please. One thing that's important to understand about California and all the tribes that are here that makes California pretty unique is that about a third of California Native nations are not federally recognized. This route here is the route of colonization in California, and it also corresponds to where there are not federally recognized tribes. As Gabriella alluded to in her talk, often people associate Native American tribes in Casinos with casinos and gaming and reservations. And all of those things are true and real, but not for those of us really along the coast, not for those of us in Los Angeles and Orange County. And what that means is several things. It means, one, we have no lands or waters that we can call our own. So we're entirely dependent upon private entities and local and state entities for access to water, to cultural items, to gather, to things like that. And it also means that we, you know, aren't able to avail ourselves of certain funding opportunities that are available to federally recognized tribes. So what you get is landless tribes who are far under-resourced in terms of capacity to do this work. And that's an important thing to understand when you're looking at how to be better allies to tribes in Southern California. Next slide, please. This slide is one that is always challenging to talk about because, you know, there's the visual representation of a white supremacist hate speech happening here. But I include it because I think often for folks that are outside of tribal communities, they may not necessarily understand that this kind of settler colonial violence is ongoing. It never stopped and it's still happening today. Doctrine of discovery is critical for folks to gain an understanding about if you really want to understand how to dismantle institutional racism and white supremacist culture in water planning. And that's because, you know, the foundations of the systems that we're in today are really rooted in this doctrine of discovery, which basically authorized and empowered people to enslave some people and to commit genocide and land theft against others. And I think we all understand manifest destiny, as that kind of iteration of the doctrine of discovery in the United States. The photo in the center was taken during the pandemic on the campus of Chapman University, where I was teaching at the time. And all of the faculty got, a copy of these flyers to just let people know what was happening. And it's just really telling, right? Manifest destiny, doctrine of discovery, and the swastika. So that interconnectedness between institutional racism, white supremacist culture, and the settler colonial belief systems is still very much alive until today. Next slide, please. And here are examples of California finance attempted genocide. In this table, you can see a listing of all the private militia Indian hunting expeditions in the mid-1800s. And in the second column is the amount of dollars that the state of California reimbursed those private militias. And then the next column is how much the United States then reimbursed the state of California. And it's important for me to include this in all these presentations because folks need to understand that the settler colonial violence that was inflicted upon and is still inflicted upon California Indian people today was a combination of private actors, the state, and the federal government. And so that's a lot of comprehensive hate to untangle and to be working against today. Next slide, please. This slide is just a listing of some of the laws in the 1800s, which created a system where California Indians were legally allowed to be enslaved. And to note that this isn't that long ago. Like we're talking about 70 years ago or something. So it's not that long ago in time. Next slide. This is one of my tribal elders and an SPI board member, Tongva Nahashamam, artist, writer, and activist, L. Frank Manriquez. So her homelands include Los Angeles and Orange County. And it's just such a powerful quote, and I think so accurate, and where there's a disconnect between agencies and nonprofit organizations and tribes a lot of times. Other people are seeing, parking structures and freeways, but for tribal people, we still see our rivers and our sacred homeland. Next slide, please. I want to talk about some concepts that are really important to understand when we're talking about tribes. And so one is Indigenous self-determination, which comes from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And I want to highlight a distinction between what's understood as tribal sovereignty and then indigenous sovereignty. So tribal sovereignty often refers to the legal recognition in the United States of the inherent sovereignty of American Indian nations. The law applied to American Indians by US government is called federal Indian law. And although this law is undermined by various acts, legal decisions, and policies over the years, it does still stand. Indian reservations are recognized as what can be termed nations within. Each has its own government and sovereign powers to make laws, tax, and most also have their own tribal justice systems. Next slide, please. The distinction between tribal sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty is important because, as I alluded to earlier, non-federally recognized tribes don't have reservations, don't have land bases over which to assert legal jurisdiction. Indigenous sovereignty is distinguishable from tribal sovereignty in that it is not a nation-state recognition of inherent sovereignty under nation-state dominion. Rather, it arises from indigenous traditional knowledge belonging to each indigenous nation, tribe, First Nation, or community. It consists of spiritual ways, culture, language, social and legal systems, political structures, and inherent relationships with lands, waters, and all upon them. Indigenous sovereignty exists regardless of what the nation state does or does not do, and it continues as long as the people that are a part of it continue. This is really critical because Sovereignty isn't something designated by a state or federal agency. Sovereignty is inherent, and there's a recognition that it's inherent because Native nations have existed for thousands of years before the United States was ever even a dream in someone's mind. And that's critical for you all to understand when you're doing work and wanting to be better allies with tribes, is that tribal nations will never be stakeholders in this work. They're sovereign nations with whom there's a government to government relationship. Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We can go on to the next slide. And we mentioned this in the video that was shared with you earlier, but we want to uplift the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And that really is the standard that we're pushing for, not just mere consultation, but free, prior, and informed consent. And the only way, that can be possible is when tribes really do have a seat at the decision-making table. Next slide, please. There we go. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. So according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, our rights as Indigenous peoples to maintain and continue these relationships are in no way hindered by the status of who owns the land. Next slide, please. These are some federal laws that are related to Indigenous rights and water protection. The National Historic Preservation Act, particularly Section 106, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I'm not going to get into those right now. We're going to talk more about state law since we are running short on time. Next slide, please. California Native American Heritage Commission, Gabriella mentioned in her land acknowledgement. I encourage you all to familiarize yourself with this agency. As I showed, from the map before, everywhere you work is California Indian land. But how do you find out who within those Native nations to contact? By contacting the California Native American Heritage Commission. You can reach out to them, identify yourself, explain why you're seeking input from local tribes and where the area in question is, and they will send you a list of the tribal elected leaders for that particular area. Next slide, please. Two executive orders that are really foundational for California are B 1011 and N 1519. B 1011 is when former Governor Brown acknowledged that the special relationship with California Indian tribes, and also it made explicit the fact that the term California Indian tribe includes all federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes. And Newsom's more recent executive order was the first time the state is officially acknowledged and apologized on behalf of the state for its role in state-sponsored attempted genocide. Next slide. SB 18 was adopted in 2004, and that was the first large-scale comprehensive tribal consultation law. So anytime a local government is going to amend or redraft general plan, it triggers tribal consultation, and that consultation is on a government-to-government basis. Next slide, please. AB 52 was more recently adopted. It was adopted in 2014, and it's an amendment to the California Environmental Quality Act, which recognizes that California tribes' expertise regarding cultural resources and provides a method for agencies to incorporate tribal knowledge into their environmental review. Under AB 52, California tribes have the ability to establish, through a formal notice letter, a standing request to consult with a lead agency regarding any proposed project subject to CEQA in their ancestral homeland. Next slide, please. And I wanted to include some water-specific state policies just so that you would have a reference for this kind of work. The Department of Water Resources policy is that California Native American tribal governments and tribal communities have sovereign authority over their members and territory and a unique relationship with California resources. California tribes and tribal communities, whether federally recognized or not, have distinct cultural, spiritual, environmental, economic, and public health interests and valuable traditional cultural knowledge about California resources. So GWR is both recognizing California Natives' unique relationships with place and the sovereign authority of these nations, regardless of their status in terms of federal recognition. And that's really important. Next slide, please. California Water Board Tribal Consultation Policy is to develop effective communication with all California Native American tribes that allows for meaningful participation and input when developing or revising the Water Board's regulations, rules, policies, or programs that may impact tribes. Next slide, please. And I wanted to briefly mention, before my time is up, the tribal beneficial uses. As many of you are probably aware, and some of you may have participated in those meetings, Los Angeles Water Board did recently adopt and recognize cultural uses as a beneficial use. And that effort is longstanding and was actually originated with California Indian Environmental Alliance in Northern California. So gratitude to them for making that happen. And we're seeing now, almost a decade later, places like Los Angeles adopting tribal beneficial use. Next slide, please. And I wanted to conclude this section before I turn it over to Maritza with another reflection on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And you'll recall that I mentioned prioritizing the standard of free, prior, and informed consent. And I did want to note for all of you that we actually in California can, push for utilization of the standards in UNDRIP. And that is because by Joint Resolution 42 in 2014, the state of California did express its endorsement of the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so another way, in reflection back to the questions from earlier, that folks can be allies is really press your agencies to use these standards that the state legislature saw fit to recognize and acknowledge in 2014. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Maritza, and then after her time, we will have an opportunity for Q&A on this section. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So I'm going to move through this really quickly. This is really a broad understanding of the legal rights of nature or the rights of Mother Earth. And under Western thought, in 1972, Professor Christopher Stone published an article, I believe he was a professor at USC, where he argued that under existing law, nature was considered rightless with no legal recognized right to defend and enforce. And so this caught traction within Western culture. And but as well, I'm sharing some examples here of how there were other communities that were working off of those, the 72 publication. But within Indigenous cultures, this has been a concept of respecting Mother Nature since time immemorial, as many have shared already. If you can move to the next slide, please. So this is just an example because I wanted to start globally for us to understand how this concept of designating nature with legal rights and creating a legal framework for Indigenous tribes around the world to utilize to continue to protect stolen territories or water and land is really important to share because it has over the years been picking up momentum. And so if you could share the video, please. I think there's no sound, but at least I'm not hearing any. But, it's
in Cochabamba, 30,000 people from over 100 countries came together for 1 week in April of 2010 calling for protecting the rights of Mother Earth and creating a document entitled the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth.
Emprender el camino de la armonía con la naturaleza y el respeto a la vida. Requerimos forjar un nuevo sistema que restablezca la armonía con la naturaleza y entre los seres humanos. Solo puede haber equilibrio con la naturaleza si hay equidad entre los seres humanos.
I don't know that we're going to get a specific document that's going to work at the United Nations. What we're getting is this very, very strong alignment among people that this is a very important issue. And I think it'll start, I think what'll come out of this is the issue will be part of discussions in national conventions. It'll be part of discussions in municipal discussions. Civil society is going to be activated out of this and is going to get really involved and make sure that this discussion about rights for nature and how to activate it will come out of this. It's going to come out of this conference for sure. There's going to be a lot of people engaged in this conference.
So just to move forward, this in turn designating the rights of nature in the National Constitution of Bolivia is one of the first ever, and it's very telling of how the values are inform policy. The value of designating Mother Nature with rights. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And as well, so, you know, you have other countries such as Bolivia and declaring the rights of Mother Nature. And so this is just a demonstration of how in this continent, in the southern region of Abya Yala, or this continent, there's a lot of movement happening. Next slide, please. And then here is just a quick diagram or chart of the various countries that have already advocated for either their river with a right, a legal entity, as a legal entity. And some of the examples here are, you know, India, Australia, New Zealand, Ecuador, Colombia, and there are structures that exist in where they can decide, usually and primarily indigenous led, where they decide what type of management will take place, for lack of a better word. Stewardship in this case will take place, whether it'll be with government or independent. And so each state, each country is different, and there are many nuances involved in this, as you all can imagine, but it's important to just kind of share and give a broad example of how that works at this time for some of these countries. Next slide, please. And New Zealand is an example where they designated their river as a legal entity having rights. And as you see the quote there, you know, it is about ensuring that the purpose of having these legal rights is to ensure that the river is respected in the correct manner. And I'm going to skip that video. So if we can move on, please. Then we already have examples here of things of these efforts happening nationally with northern tribes. For example, we have the Ponca Nation who recognize the rights of nature, passing a statute in response to fracking. And we have the White Earth Band, Ojibwe, who recently adopted the rights of Manumin, which is to protect the legal rights of their water resources, which rice grows on and in which the community heavily depends on for sustainability. Next slide, please. And then here in California, we have the example of the Yurok tribe, which is a federally recognized tribe, one of the highest number per tribe members. And in 2019, the council adopted the resolution granting the rights of personhood to the Klamath River. And again, you know, it's the first river in North America to have personhood rights declared. And, the whole purpose was, for them to be able to continue to take care of the river. And because there's such a reliance on the river for food and cultural and use, it's a huge victory for the tribe. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of as I was saying, why, some of the tribes have been able to do this, and why they work so hard to designate the river as a living entity. In there, you have a photo there of the harvest going on around the river, and the reliance on the river's natural food that the tribe depends on. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of things to consider because each city, each state, each tribe, will want different things to consider when designating a river as a living entity. There are some things that may not be to their benefit because it is post-settlement cultural diversity, so they have to take into account the reality of the river and all the entities around the river. And again, just emphasizing it could be distinct according to locale. And yeah, so just wanted to emphasize those considerations. Next slide, please. And the impacts, right? So there are some possible impacts, and of course, always unintended consequences or impacts. And, one being is that tribes are working within colonial structures that can impose restrictions and threaten tribal sovereignty. And I can't help but share, the example right now with regards to the LA River. It's so complex, and it's almost it may seem almost insurmountable of a task to designate, for example, if the tribes wish to designate the LA River as a living entity, because there are so many reasons, according to the LA River Master Plan, that, for example, they cannot deconcretize it. Or for example, the proposition of designate or creating platform parks is just adding to the concrete that the river already has, which is something that I think Jessica covered as far as concrete in the LA River. But those are some of the things that, there's so many things to take into account when considering these efforts. Next slide, please. And just lastly, it's really a reminder of what everybody has already been sharing here. It is about a relationship. It's real clear that, indigenous cultures from around the world have very different cosmovision than European culture or cosmovision. And, in colonization, as we've all been hearing, one of the first things was to commodify all natural life for sale. And, we've hit a point where now we are all paying the consequences for that. So it's really important to keep in mind that we every step that we take in our efforts here, we have to remember relationship. We have to remember respect. We have to always put in the forefront restoration, and more than anything, in my opinion, rematriation. So returning to the feminine seeds back into the communities of origin. The indigenous concept refers to reclaiming of ancestral remains, spirituality, culture, science, knowledge, and resources, instead of the more patriarchally associated repatriation. And the last thing I want to end with is planning. For any type of planning that is done within these government entities, it's really important to keep in mind that we're not just planning for 7 years or 50 years or 25 years, but we should keep in mind planning for 7 generations ahead. Too often there are these short-sighted planning propositions put up by many entities, and that can no longer exist. We don't have the time. We don't have the time to come back to the table and find out a new way of learning to ride a car, but yet still using extracted methods of fueling a car, whether it's energy or whether it's oil. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Marisa. Yes, folks, we know we covered a lot in a really rapid fire pace right now. So please feel free to populate the chat. As folks are thinking of questions they might have for Marisa and I'll just reflect on a discussion that I was really excited about in the chat around, you know, allies working to really demand of, you know, the local water planning committees why there's not any tribal representation. And so I just want to name that, you know, I think Sacred Places Institute would definitely be interested in talking with folks further about that. So when you get a copy of our presentation, you will be able to have our contact info, and please do reach out to us. As a transition into the next section on allyship, one thing that I will say about allyship is that it's always really important to make sure that you're in dialogue with local Native nations. Because one thing that can happen is people get really excited and want to move forward on things, but the issue is you have to make sure that you're moving forward in alignment with and remembering that free, prior, and informed consent standard in terms of you know, how you're working with the local Native nation. So I don't see any questions that have come up yet, and so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gabriela and Jessa to wrap us up with the ally section. And then at the end of their presentation, all four of us will share a reflection on examples of positive and negative attempts at allyship with you all. So take it away, ladies.
Understanding how to be a good ally. Allyship, this little chart, it is by this person. I don't want to ruin or butcher their name, but you can find their chart. They have a lot of good charts online. And they basically made one on authentic allyship and performative allyship, which is what Jessa will be going over. So I'm going to go over this chart first, and then I'll read the slides. So authentic allyship is like you're taking risks and holding yourself and others accountable. Your brand is of no concern. You're educating yourself. You're examining your own privilege and using it to help. You're committed to anti-racist work. You're not virtue signaling, and you're taking real action. It's not about you, it's about the people that you are helping or trying to uplift. Sitting with discomfort, and then empathy, grief, or outrage. So some types of allyship is like opening a space with land acknowledgement in a non-performative way, and understanding that land acknowledgements are just the tip of the iceberg. Creating meaningful relationships with Indigenous people whose homelands you live or work on, and then working with tribal families and communities to understand their viewpoints and their needs. More is like being willing to give up your seat at the table if Indigenous voices are not present. Giving credit where credit is due. If an idea is utilized from Native folks, they should be involved in how that idea is presented and compensated. And compensating Indigenous folks for their time, knowledge, and work. Roland, in the video that we shared with all of you prior to this meeting, said this, and I thought it was really impactful. Aside from listening, actually following through with the help that you are offering. Don't be a symbolic ally. Nobody wants that. And it's true. It's really easy to be a symbolic ally. It's easy to be like, yeah, we help them. We support those Tonga people. We support the Ohashiman in whatever they're doing. But being an authentic ally is putting yourself in an uncomfortable position and looking at your own privilege and looking at your own looking at your own way of seeing the world and sort of not necessarily like changing it, but putting it into perspective how your view of the world has impacted other communities or how that view itself has had negative effects. Yeah, I'll go ahead and just pass it on to Jessa.
Okay. And appropriation can look like wearing clothing to show appreciation or respect. But when a Native person says that actually is offensive, not taking it off. So understanding things like headdresses, eagle feathers, hawk feathers, also selling those items are highly disrespectful and offensive. There's no appreciation behind that. Stealing ideas and quotes from Indigenous folks and not stating, who you stole these ideas from or are borrowing them from is highly offensive and considered appropriation. Obviously, excluding Indigenous folks on conversations and actions about their own homelands. And so also understanding that, it's not about checking a box, but also just because you asked an Indigenous person to participate doesn't mean that you're an ally, because if you ask a Lakota person to be a part of something that's happening in Los Angeles, that's highly disrespectful to the Tongva peoples if the Tongva peoples are not there, right? That the Lakota people are Native, yes, but they are from the Dakotas, right? They're not from California. And that goes for any other nation. It's honoring us on our homelands. And like I said, I don't speak for all Indigenous people. And so all Indigenous people also don't speak for me, especially when they're on our homelands. And so that's a big, huge, like I want to just blow that up in capitalized letters for you all to understand is to honor us on our homelands means to deal with the people whose ancestral homelands you're on and not just somebody who claims indigeneity. Also using ceremonial items, that would be, musical items. It would be pipes and things of that nature, as well as fans made of feathers, and of course sage. Sage has been used out of context and it is one of our sacred items. So thinking that you're gonna take the juju, the bad juju out of the room and burning sage, it sounds cute, but it's highly disrespectful to the California Native peoples and the people that are near the border of Mexico, because white sage in particular is found only in our homelands. And that is the exact sage that is being disrespected in the black market. And so because of that, we're not able to utilize sage for our ceremonial gatherings. And it's a huge problem for our cultural ceremonies. And then also having Native folks involved at the slightest capacity just to mark the box for public approval, it's a slap in our face. I personally have been asked to do a land acknowledgement, but they're only giving me 2 minutes, or, they'll ask me to do a performative, and I have to let y'all know right now, nothing I do is performative other than, and even not even that really is my hip hop music. Everything that I do has purpose. Everything that I say serves purpose. And so I personally am not here so that you can get, more money in your funding. That's disrespectful to me. And so, once again, we are not a box to be checked. We are people to have relationships with. So I want to highlight that for you all. And thank you for listening. And we'll move on to the next slide. And so here, talking about best practices and lessons learned on allyships, I'll invite somebody from Sacred Places Institute to share positive examples of leadership. And if we want to, if anybody feels like they want to also share negative examples of leadership and why these are impactful.
I'll start just because it's just happened today, so it's fresh in my mind. And I'll share both a positive and a negative example of this. And it's around land acknowledgement, which I just, first of all, I want to uplift what Gabriella shared when she grounded us to the land, which is that it's, land acknowledgements and not just, do a land acknowledgement. It's what else are you going to do to be accountable? Because land acknowledgements absent something else is performative allyship. And so the negative example I will give today was that I was invited, and I decided I'm just going to name them because they should be named for this, by the University of California, Irvine, in shared Ahashamam and Sangha homelands, to advise the land acknowledgement task force. So they're finally creating a land acknowledgement. Great, I guess. I was confused. I thought that they were inviting myself and a Tonga person to join the land acknowledgement task force. They were not. I asked for the list of task force members, did not receive the list. This person's administrative assistant accidentally sent me the invite to the land acknowledgement task force meeting. So now I know who's on the land acknowledgement task force. Not a single Tongva or Hashimam person. And, you know, when I then responded after they said that they had inadvertently sent this invite, I said, you know, this is absurd. You cannot, you know, meaningfully create any sort of meaningful land acknowledgement if there are no, you know, Hashimam or Tongva people as a part of the land acknowledgement committee. And, you know, then I received a response from the Chancellor of Equity and Diversity and Inclusion or whatever, in which he assured me that the Land Acknowledgement Task Force really wants to hear us talk about A, B, and C, and that we will be invited to present to them. So that's a really horrible example and a great example of performative allyship, because we didn't ask them for the land acknowledgement. At no point did there's no transparency, right? Like if you use the rubric of free, prior, and informed consent that I talked about, we didn't consent to that. We haven't received information. The only reason we know who's even on this committee, which FYI, there are people on the committee that have been quite harmful to local tribal people. You know, and when we called them out on it, the response was very much, you know, pushing us aside and minimizing what I had to say. On the other side of that, and I won't mention the name of the entity because it's not finalized yet, we're still in conversations, but a very large, you know, arts organization locally reached out to Sacred Places Institute a couple months ago and said, hey, we realize we're remiss. We don't have a land acknowledgement, nor are we, you know, nor do we have protocols around how to be accountable and respectful and in right relationship with the Tonga people. So we've had, I think, 2 meetings so far, and there were several Tonga folks, intergenerational, and myself present, and several people from that institution present. And we met for about an hour and a half, and we talked about what they wanted and what we thought was important. And now that entity has come back to us with a scope of work and outlining in great detail what it is they'd like to do. And we're going to have a follow-up conversation tomorrow. And there's no timeline. There's no, you need to do this by next week or A, B, and C. You know, it's not a photo op. It's literally, they've identified that they're remiss. And now they're trying to work with local tribal communities, not just to create a land acknowledgement, but to really understand. And I'm very excited about that scope of work because it's going to include things like doing comprehensive training for their board members, for their leadership bodies, right? That's the kind of investment that is moving beyond performative allyship. So, you know, we would welcome any opportunities if folks are interested in seeing how to move your organization to be in more right relationship. Talk with us. I mean, we're happy to do trainings for leaderships and boards because it really is critical that everybody, you know, who has authority or decision-making power in these spaces be on board with this kind of work. And I could go on forever, so I will stop and let someone else talk about a positive and or negative example of allyship.
I'll start with the negative and then go to a positive. This is just a general one, but in terms of like negative examples of leadership is having your board of directors not know anything about your agency's supposed work with tribes, not knowing anything about what the requirements are, what the state of California needs or wants from you in your efforts to work with tribes. We've been in several situations now where we've gone to agency board meetings and we've asked them like, what is your stance on this? What is your view? And then a lot of the board members are just, oh, we'll get back to you because we're not sure. And that's pretty concerning because as a board member, you should be on top of what your agency knows and what on top of what your agency is leading and supporting. So if you don't know anything about your Indigenous engagement plan, in regards to like working with the indigenous people on whose lands that you're either taking hold of or just like working on. It's pretty alarming. So I would just say that's a negative example. And a positive example is when, you know what, I'll just flip the switch. There is an agency, I'm not going to name them, but one of their board members actually knows everything that there is about their agency's indigenous involvement and keeping indigenous people involved, and actually stood up and fought for indigenous people at their board meeting. Things were just going to be passed and keep on going, and he stopped the meeting and was like, hey, how is this impacting the indigenous people whose lands that this situation is on? And all the board members looked at each other, and everybody sort of just like Spider-Man pointed, and we all, then the conversation was held. And I think that's a really positive example of allyship and leadership, is knowing that your organization, has these stances, and instead of just letting things pass by and you're like, oh, well, I could have said something, but I didn't, but making that meeting take longer, making the meeting like difficult in effort to help to be an ally. Yeah, and I will leave it there.
I'll share a really quick one. So we know for a fact that Tree People was pretty racist and wasn't receptive to Indigenous peoples. But as of recent, they've proven that it's never too late to change and to grow and to attempt to learn and gain relationships. And so us being here with you all today, representing with Tree People, is a best practice on how lessons are learned on allyship. So I'm very grateful to Tree People for making the attempt, for trying over and again to learn and understand and do what's right. And that includes opening up space to the Indigenous peoples whose lands they are, because Tree People has a lot of land, and it was never opened up to us prior to recent. And so I'm very grateful to Tree People for these relationships that are being acquired. And so to all of you here today, whether you stem from some organization that was once racist or maybe still have some racism in it, it's never too late to open your heart and to open your mind and to help, kick those doors open and to change the hearts and minds of those in your organizations. And I will go ahead and mute myself. And I don't know if we have time for Maritza to share something.
Yeah, for sure. But real quick, before I turn it over to you, Maritza, I just wanted to uplift one point out of what Jessa just said, which I think is key for everyone to understand, is that building these positive relationships takes time. Another example, an agency that we had quite a conflict with, because I found out they were name dropping SPI and advocating for us without our consent, free, prior, and informed consent. It goes back to that always. And so we had a meeting, and I was pretty upset and called them out on it. And instead of shutting down, they were willing to listen to and take in that anger and reflect on it. And since then, for I think a year and a half now, we've consistently had meetings once a month. And then that's been wonderful, because it's allowed us to get to know them better, to be in relationship. And now we're doing some great programming together and have some really cool stuff on the horizon. But the key pieces there that I hope you all can take away from this in terms of recommendations on allyship is, one, it takes time, to heal those relationships. And two, you have to be committed to not walking away. You have to understand. That's why, we share all those slides about the awful violent history of California, because that's a legacy that exists and is embodied in the very DNA of Indian people today. And so it's important to understand all of those pieces and really be in it for the long haul if you want to be an ally. And with that, I will turn it over to Marisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all wonderful examples. I would have to share a recent example that for me was also eye-opening, in that, there's a way that, for example, some coalitions operate, or most should operate, in that there's collective decision-making going on. But at times, sometimes government entities, whether it's local or state, will intentionally, I believe, attempt to divide and conquer when it comes to major decisions. And we had an example of that happening most recently, where an individual an individual did take it upon themselves to take a meeting without the consent of everyone in that meeting. And so, you know, those things just can break coalitions and shatter them. And in the end, it's not being true to the true intent of a coalition, which is to move forward together. So that's one example that I just want to share that most people may have experienced. But the other example where it's great allyship is, again, as I have shared in the past, East Yard is a great BIPOC EJ organization that I just feel like they're siblings. You know, a sibling always has your back no matter what. And this organization goes out of their way to ensure that tribal folks have a say in many of these important decisions that are being held in the LA County. So we deeply appreciate that. And I'll end with saying, I believe it might be, you know, part of their policy to do that. So if you all are inspired, perhaps you can integrate that as part of a policy or push for that. And those are my examples. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Would love it if folks have questions, please put those in the chat, or you know, also if anybody just has any final reflections that y'all want to share. We've got 5 minutes left, and we could talk forever about this stuff, but really want to be as responsive as possible to you all. So please feel free to share any reflections, one learning you'll take away from this training, or any questions that you have remaining from anything any of us have shared today. Yes, that's an easy question to answer. You will get a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards, and you'll see on, I think it's the next slide, there's a list of resources and hyperlinks that we've included, as well as all of our contact info. Elliot, looks like Elliot has a question.
Yeah, thank you all so much. The line of work that I'm in, so thank you for this whole presentation. It's been awesome to hear everything. The line of work I'm in is educational, and we're working close with a couple of Native groups, a couple of Indigenous groups, to re-indigenize our curriculum for them to deliver it. And I was curious to just kind of hear these amazing people on the call today kind of speak to that co-design process of re-indigenizing existing curriculum. If that's too nebulous of a question, I might be able to narrow it down a little bit.
No, I think that's great. Thank you for raising that. That is super important, and been something that we're very passionate about at Sacred Places Institute. The first folks that we work with on curriculum redesign is with Crystal Cove. So if you go to Crystal Cove Conservancy's website, during the pandemic, they created a really robust digital educational program. And prior, there'd been no, local tribal representation. And now there are videos up from several Tonga and Ahashiman people. And we also meet with them regularly, along with folks from Sherman Indian School, to go through their curriculum piece by piece and see where it's missing important content about Indigenous folks. And Sacred Places Institute is also working through the River Rangers program with various entities that are participating in that to go through each of their curriculum. And one super cool example, I forget which org right now, but one of them, had featured Sage, and thanks to a conversation with Jessa and Gabriella, they started to understand more like the concerns around representing Sage absent any sort of connection to what Jessa shared. And as a result, now the coloring book they have for children features, a representation of Jessa basket weaving and having that conversation. So that's a very tangible, clear moment at which we can disrupt these cycles of institutional racism, including in curriculum. Anybody else have anything they want to share in response?
I do see that Catherine raised a question. How do you suggest non-Indigenous folks talk about or uplift the idea of water as a relative without appropriating?
I think one thing is just to always credit you know, if you'll notice maybe when you see the PowerPoint presentation, the slide with the quote from L. Frank Manriquez, it not only like credits the book that she co-authored where that quote comes from, but it also credits the dissertation written by Tonga scholar and filmmaker Anne-Marie Mendoza, where I first found that quote, right? And, you know, legally speaking, I wouldn't necessarily need to include either of those, but it's essential, like from a moral and cultural perspective, to do that because of how many times Indigenous words and wisdoms are just taken, you know? So again, I would say, you know, the quick answer to that is the free, prior, and informed consent. Talk to Indigenous folks about it and say you'd like to share this, and then, you know, ask for their permission to credit them. Or, you know, I think a lot of what Marisa has shared, there's a lot of credit there that can be shared in terms of where some of these perspectives originate from. Other folks have any final reflections on that or any other points? Well, if not, then recognizing that we are just about out of time, just say much gratitude to all of you for participating. Please definitely hit us up at STI. Some of the stuff in the chat was super exciting in terms of ways people are thinking about showing up as allies. So we would love to continue this conversation with you and, you know, share with other folks when we're going to do these trainings again and just really expand the circle of knowledge around this. So thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you.
I see that Angela hopped off, so I think that means that we should all just go ahead and take it easy and get to the next one.
Yeah, I think so. I guess the only thing I had to ask real quick was, has Angela talked to all of you about the next meeting? I don't know what all y'all availability is for, I know Angela wanted to talk about some stuff and having Peters, you know, help with some things and then just figuring out our next steps.
I know that she said there was going to be one coming up that she could not do.
Okay.